Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video, I want to talk about the different types of burst timers on MapleStory, how different classes have different cooldowns, and how that might affect what class you want to main, what's better, a class that has big burst cooldowns or consistent damage, how that affects the meta, and all of that kind of stuff. So very often as you play MapleStory and you involve yourself more in different communities, you'll hear terms like, that's a 1 minute class, 2-minute class, 3-minute class, or even 6-minute class. Now, what do these things even mean? You'll also hear things like, oh, that's a DPS class, that's a burst class, that's a DPS class that has a good burst, stuff like that. What does all of that stuff mean, right? So in this video, I'm going to cover all of that stuff, and it should help you understand some of the classes better, help you understand MapleStory bossing a little bit better, and maybe it'll help you choose a main. So the first thing that I want to talk about is classes are generally categorized by what their damage distribution looks like and how long their burst cooldown is. So what do I mean by damage distribution? This is what I mean by damage distribution. So we're going to use Buccaneer as an example. This is just off the dome. This isn't like exactly 100% like what Buccaneer's damage distribution looks like on a curve. Obviously, there might be some high-level Buck mains that could maybe draw this curve a little bit more accurate, but the whole point of drawing this is to explain how different classes have different damage curves, and they get categorized based off of these damage curves. So this is a damage over time curve, and the orange lines show how high Buck's damage is at certain times. So for example, at the start of its burst, it's at the highest. Like when you have Lightning Form, Howling Fist, your Origin, all that stuff, it's, you know, that's at your peak damage. Maybe you're in Roar and stuff like that. And then as those things go away, you know, your Origin goes away after 30 seconds, your total damage output gets lower and lower. You're still in Lightning Form, so you still have that final damage boost, but once your Lightning Form goes away, it goes down, but your 90-second burst comes back up, meaning your Howling Fist, like one of your burst skills, it comes back up, so it spikes up a little, but then it falls off again because you have nothing left, no more Lightning Form, no more Origin, no more Howling Fist, nothing. You're just pressing Octo Punch and Lord of the Deep. So different classes have these different types of curves, and these curves are affected by your cooldown. So for example, you can look at Buccaneer and you'll notice that at the start of your burst, your damage is really high, and then you have another spike at the 90-second mark, and then once your 3-minute cooldown comes back up, because this has a 3-minute cooldown, Lightning Form, your damage will spike up again, and the curve sort of repeats again. But it won't be as high because there's no Origin, which has a 6-minute cooldown. So basically what I'm trying to say is the cooldown of your burst kind of determines how much damage you're doing in MapleStory. Now, that's not 100% the case all the time, because some classes, like Lyn, for example, most of their damage is within their DPS skills. And because most of their damage is in their DPS skills, their burst doesn't really super significantly impact their damage curve. So that's why we have all these different categories for the different types of classes in the game. Now, the reason why this is useful to know what the cooldowns are for burst classes is because different classes have different types of play styles, and you might not like something that's super burst favored and then falls off in DPS afterwards. So you can see with Buck in this example, the damage has some spikes. It has a spike at the start of your burst, and it has a spike at the 90-second burst, but its damage is always good-ish. So it's not like you're never doing no damage. It's still very important to DPS and have super high uptime on the boss. And for some people, for me, for example, I really like playing classes that are like this, that have consistent damage and have spikes in damage every so often. So if we look at Nightlord, for example, you'll notice that the curve is very different. So Nightlord is famously known as a very big burst class, and its cooldowns have a 3-minute cooldown. So this means that Nightlord is a 3-minute burst class because its big burst cooldowns, where most of its damage is on a 3-minute cooldown. So you'll see that like when Nightlord's Origin is up, spread and throw blasting, like it does a massive amount of damage, but then as these buffs go away, it does less and less damage, and you're left with like almost a 2-minute window where you're doing like very, very little damage. And for someone like me, I don't really like playing stuff like this because the class is only fun for like 1 minute where you're doing so much damage. But that's just me. That's just how I like playing the game. Some people really like having a big, strong, satisfying burst, and that's their type of play style. Now, this can get a little bit complicated because different bosses have different advantages. Like, for example, a class like Night Lord would do really well in Chaos Guardian Slime or Kalos because those bosses have small windows where you can do optimal damage on them. And because Night Lord, most of its damage is over here at the front, that means you can get pretty much all of your damage out on the boss during that small window and not have to worry about the rest. But if we were to go back to Buck has a lot of consistent damage, so you wouldn't make 100% use of your entire damage output because all of this wouldn't be utilized as effectively when you're prioritizing burst only for these types of bosses. But then on the flip side, there are bosses like Black Mage where you're hitting it the entire time, and having consistent DPS is really, really, really good. And you could also make up for not maybe fully optimizing your burst with your DPS. But if you're on Night Lord, if you mess up your burst, you can't really make up that damage lost, and there's nothing you could really do about it. It's more punishing to mess up on your burst when you play a big burst class than it is when you're playing a DPS class. So now that we understand DPS curves and how that might affect certain bosses, you can see that different classes have different types of burst cooldowns, which in turn affect their DPS curve, which means they are better or worse in certain scenarios. Now, there are also certain classes that can play as a 2-minute burst class and a 3-minute burst class without really hurting their total damage output. So when you're joining parties on this game, you might see that there are a bunch of different classes and the classes don't necessarily have all their cooldowns synced up properly. Some classes might have a 2-minute burst cooldown and some classes might have a 3-minute burst cooldown. So how are you supposed to sync up these burst timers? Usually what ends up happening is the 2-minute burst classes just instead hold their burst and burst on a 3-minute timer, which does usually hurt your total damage output because you're not using your skills as often as you should. But certain classes like Haero, it doesn't really matter because our 2-minute burst is really good and is comparable to a 3-minute burst. And we also have a goddess skill that takes 4 minutes to stack up. So if you were to use it every 3 minutes, then you would get better utilization of this skill in a 3-minute party. And you also have a skill like Zonko that has a 90-second cooldown, so you can use that every 90 seconds and it syncs up with the 3-minute timer. So there's certain like edge cases that are a little bit weird that make it so that a 2-minute class can play on a 3-minute timer and it's not so bad. So if you look at this skill, for example, it says cooldown 120 seconds, Sengoku Force cooldown 120 seconds. You can see that like a lot of Haero skills have a 2-minute timer. But you also have Zonko, which is a 90-second cooldown, and you have Princess Sakuna's Blessing, which is a 4-minute cooldown. So it's a little bit weird, and a lot of the cooldowns are not as perfectly lined up. So it allows this class to play either 2-minute or 3-minute. If we go to a class like Mercedes, for example, this is a much easier to understand 3-minute burst class. So if you look at Spira of LOL, cooldown 180 seconds. Urkala's Wrath, cooldown 180 seconds. Royal Knight, cooldown 180 seconds. Even your Goddess is ready every single 180 seconds. So you'll see that these cooldowns all line up on that 3-minute timer. Sylvidia's Flight cooldown 90 seconds, so it's half of that. So that gives you the opportunity to do what they call a mini burst. You have your big burst, 3-minute cooldown when all of your 3-minute stuff is up, and then you have your 90-second burst, which is your mini burst, or they just call it your 90-second burst. Now it's the same thing for 2-minute classes. Sometimes 2-minute classes, like Demon Slayer, for example, their cooldowns are on a 2-minute timer. So Demon Awakening, 2-minute cooldown. Spirit of Rage, 2-minute cooldown. Demon Bane, 2-minute cooldown. Orthrus, 2-minute cooldown. Even your Goddess as well, it's ready every single 2 minutes, right? So Demon Slayer, if we were to hypothetically graph it on a curve, it would reach those spikes more often. It would hit those 2-minute spikes on the curve more often. The damage would go up more often because it's every 2 minutes. But Mercedes, it would only spike up every 3 minutes really because it's a 3-minute burst class. Now, again, where this gets a little bit tricky is because sometimes some burst classes, some 2-minute burst classes, their burst is almost as good as a 3-minute burst class. So in certain scenarios, it makes them superior. But generally, a 3-minute burst class will probably have a higher burst than a 2-minute burst class. But there's some classes like Arc, for example, that have a really, really good 2-minute burst, or Angelic Buster that have a really, really good 2-minute burst, and it makes them comparable to 3-minute classes. And that's where the game balance kind of gets fucked. Now, I mentioned before that there are like 1-minute burst classes and 6-minute burst classes as well. So most of the classes in this game are 2 and 3-minute burst classes, but let's talk about 1 and 6-minute burst classes and what they mean. So a 1-minute burst class, like AB for example, you'll see that a lot of its cooldowns are still on 2 minutes. Sparkle Burst is 2 minutes, Spotlight is 2 minutes, and these two are big damaging skills for AB, but you also have cooldowns that are on a 1-minute timer, like Supreme Supernova, Pretty Exaltation, which is what makes you summon a lot of Soul Seekers, and most importantly, Mighty Mascot, which you have a lot of damage from on this class. So these only have a 60-second cooldown. So it makes it so that AB gets a considerable spike of damage if you were to put it on a curve every 1 minute. Now, obviously, your 2-minute burst is bigger because you have more skills coming up every 2 minutes, but your 1-minute burst is still pretty comparable because you still have a bunch of cooldowns that are on a 1-minute timer. So that's why people would refer to AB as like a 1-minute class or 2-minute class, because its 1 minute damage is still really good. So some people might really like this playstyle because you're bursting very often. You're using your cooldowns very often. And it makes you feel like you're always doing something versus playing Night Lord, for example, where once your burst is done, you're not doing as much damage. It doesn't feel as good to play. Now, what's a 6-minute burst class? That sounds really weird, right? What's a 6-minute burst class? Like, surely that's not a good thing. So an example of a 6-minute burst class that people will often say, they'll say Kane, maybe they'll say Arc, maybe they'll say Fire Poison sometimes, maybe they'll say Kali. Those are examples of classes that people will say a 6-minute burst class. I'm just going to outright and say it that I don't really think 6-minute burst class is something that is that important or something that should be really like noted or a consideration as to whether you should play a class or not. I just want to talk to you guys about what the term means so that if you ever hear it, you know what it means. But for me personally, I don't think it's really that important, and it's not something you should really like consider when choosing a class. So 6-minute burst class, if we were to again put a class on a curve, obviously the only cooldown in the game that does a lot of damage is your origin skill, and it has a 6-minute cooldown, right? The reason why people refer to classes as a 6-minute burst is because most of their damage in terms of just bursting will come from their origin, and when they don't have their origin up, they don't really do that much burst damage. And the reason why this term even developed was because of certain bosses in the game like Kalos and Kaling, where having a really, really big burst is really important. So when people started recruiting for these bosses, they would kind of see each other as how much burst can you offer to the party. Like, that's really like all it boiled down to, is like how much burst can you offer. And certain classes like Fire Poison, who's a very big DPS class, doesn't really offer that much burst outside of its origin. So people started labeling certain classes like as a 6-minute class because that's when their biggest burst comes out. They don't really have a 3-minute or 2-minute burst that's that notable compared to their origin. But realistically, for most people playing this game, it's not really like an issue you should worry about, in my opinion. It's kind of just something that got over embellished and isn't really that important, to be honest with you. You can play a class that is supposedly a 6-minute burst class and still clear every boss in the game perfectly fine. So now that we know about DPS curves and different cooldowns and what 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, 6-minute classes are, how does this affect what you should play and what should you play, right? How does this affect the meta and, like, you know, if you want to go end game, like, what's the best type of class to play? Should you play a 1 minute burst, a 2 minute burst, 3-minute burst class? Like, what should you play? So the first thing that I would consider is, what kind of playstyle are you looking for on this game? Do you want to play a class that has constant damage and they're always needing to stick on the boss to do a lot of damage, like Lin, for example, or AB? You could do your super big burst like Mercedes or Night Lord, and you'll be able to provide a lot of damage all at once, but after that you don't really need to do as much, so you can just focus more on surviving. But in reality, you do always want to hit the boss no matter what class you play, but it's more punishing on a DPS class if you're not always DPSing, obviously. So once you find out what kind of playstyle that you want, then I would consider which are the best classes in the type of playstyle that I want to play. Another thing to consider is Oz rings. I'm just going to straight out say that it's not too important to consider Oz rings when you're trying to choose a class to main, but I do want to just talk about it real quick. So a class like Night Lord that has a 3-minute burst cooldown, the Oz rings have a 3-minute cooldown themselves. Besides the continuous ring basically gives you a continuous amount of bonus damage by having this ring equipped. So it's really good for DPS classes. But all the other Oz rings have a 3-minute cooldown. So when you're playing a class like Night Lord that has a 3-minute cooldown burst, it syncs up really well with the Oz ring. So it makes it so that you don't need multiple Oz rings to get your damage out optimally. But if you're playing a class like Arc or Ice Lightning, for example, that are on a 2-minute burst cooldown, you're going to need multiple Oz rings, and you're going to have to swap back and forth between them so that every time you burst, you have that bonus damage that you get from an Oz ring. If you want a video on Oz rings in general, let me know in a comment below. Now, again, I want to reiterate that Oz rings are not really like a make or break decision that you should think about on choosing a main. I just wanted to talk about them real quick. Now, let's talk about the future of the game, where this game is headed and where it's trending based off of burst and DPS. So right now in MapleStory, according to future Korean balance changes, now again, this might change, who knows, but as of right now, as of making this video, the game is trending to a more DPS focused playstyle and less of a support final damage stacking playstyle. Now, final damage stacking is like a whole other concept, but all that means essentially is you get a bunch of classes that have support and they use all of their support buffs at once, and it makes this like singularity point of like all these support buffs stacked at once and everybody is super duper duper strong. But because in the upcoming balance patch, they're changing it so that supports can't really do that anymore, and they're buffing classes' own self-damage, it makes it so that DPS is a lot more valuable these days, especially because future bosses seem to have a low party capacity. So for example, Extreme Lotus, you can only run with one other person. Kaling, first phase, you only have your partner in your room, and then eventually becomes a full 6-man. Limbo, which is going to come out, is a 3-man party only. So what that means is supports are becoming not as OP as they have been traditionally, and classes that have their own very high self-damage and DPS are very important, because Lotus is a DPS oriented boss too, because you can hit it the whole time, and so is Limbo. You can hit it the whole time, so having really good DPS is very important. So classes that have more frequent spikes in their damage curve, like 2-minute classes, 1-minute classes, are becoming more and more valuable. So if you want to play a future-proofing type endgame class, I would recommend playing a class that has good DPS and good burst. Demon Slayer comes to mind. Angelic Buster comes to mind. Kane is a really good option, and Arc. Like, those 4 are really, really good options. They have good 2-minute burst or consistent damage, and they have a really good burst as well. But does that mean that playing anything else is bricked and you can't become an endgamer, you can't go late? No, of course not. At the end of the day, you can play literally whatever you want and you will still be able to clear everything that this game has to offer. Classes are getting constantly buffed and nerfs. A lot of the weaker classes like Lara are getting big buffs next patch. So there's nothing to really worry about, to be honest with you. If you have any questions, please let me know in a comment below. I know this video might be a little bit weird, but I think it's important to understand these types of concepts on this game so that you know how your damage output is, how to better sync up in parties, and maybe what class to play as well if you're new to this game. If you want a full list of what classes are 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, I'm going to put it in a pinned comment down below and you can look at it there. I appreciate you guys watching. Obviously, subscribe if this video helped you out. Come to my Twitch channel. You can ask me whatever you want. I'll help you out there. And with that all being said, have a wonderful day. Shout out to my members, Blazefire, Shooms, Shagad, Ravi Espa, Koga, Piconir, Jesse B, Dante Victory, CK, Prelman, J, and Blunt Poppy Supreme Oil Backwards. I appreciate you guys so much and have a great day.